Hello again, folks. Jeffrey Donaldson here with another Jeweller's Eye reading of a single poem from a new volume of Canadian poetry. I went to hear a couple of readers at the new quarterly writers' conference in Waterloo in the fall, and when I was there I picked up a little chapbook by Kerry-Lee Powell entitled The Wreckage, published by Grey Suit Editions in London, England in 2013. I was just standing at the table of book offerings, browsing through some of the titles. Was it Mark Strand that said that you can begin any poem and know within one or two lines whether the writer is writing with any authority or not? Well, Powell got my attention very quickly, and perhaps in exactly this way, with the opening lines of the poem I've chosen to look at, entitled The Lifeboat. All night in his lifeboat my father sang, to keep the voices of the other men who cried in the wreckage from reaching him. He sang what he knew of the requiem, of the hit parade and the bits of hymns. He sang until he would never sing again, scalding his raw throat with sea-water until his ribs heaved, until the salt wept from his eyes on dry land, flecked at his lips in his squalling rages, streaked the sheets in his night sweats, as night after night the reassembled ship scattered its parts on the shore of his bed, and the lifeboat eased him out again, to drown each night among singing men. Now, we read on the back of the book that the lyric poems in this pamphlet were inspired by a shipwreck endured by Powell's father during the Second World War, his subsequent struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, and eventual suicide. So these poems, many of them, are offered in the way of elegy, that familiar literary form in which we grieve and remember the deceased. There's an irony here with this elegy, or layerings of the grieving that is embodied here. This is a remembered experience in the life of Powell's father himself, whose absence is grieved. But the poem is also, from the perspective of the father, an elegy for the men who died on the ship that he was rescued from. And just as the daughter sings of her father, so here we have the singing and remembrance of those who are lost at sea. It is as though the father in his boat singing is and has been writing an elegy of his own. And we'll want to come back to these implications shortly. The poet and writer Peter Sachs wrote a book on English elegy about 25 years ago, and he makes the interesting case there that what lies at the core of elegy is not a recovery or resurrection of the deceased, as it were, these being impossible, but instead a recreation or reinvention of the self, the speaking voice, who has been left behind with this huge hole within, and who, in order to continue living, has to rearrange his or her psychological furniture, as it were, in relation to that absence. The speaking voice has to figure out what sort of person it's going to be, given that a large part of its identity has died from within it. So reinvention, recreation, not of the deceased, but of the one who remembers, recollects the deceased. So you can see that Powell's elegy for her father is almost an embodiment of that process. A man sings a song in relation to the tragic death of men dear to him, and in that singing discovers that he himself is changed. And the poem sort of maps out that transformation of the speaking voice itself as it tries to come to terms with the original loss. And there are further ironies around the subject of elegy, or maybe, I'm not sure, maybe it's not that unfamiliar in elegy itself for the speaking voice to be lamenting that, in this case that he himself has survived while others have died. Would that I could have died with them, or that they could have lived with me. That is, here it is the fact of having survived that is for the speaking voice intensely grieved and struggled with. And it is that slow dying, as it were, that the poet herself grieves as she watches her father become, as it were, lost at sea in the aftermath and drowned in his own memories. We'll come to all that. So, from the beginning, the title, yes, doing good work. A lifeboat is called a lifeboat because it is where life is preserved. But there is also the further metaphor of life itself as a kind of boat. That is, so long as one is alive, one is floating in a boat above the depths or abyss that would claim that life. And so you get this kind of doubleness all the way through the poem, that the father is and was preserved in a lifeboat in such a way that his entire life has become like that lifeboat as it has drifted along in time. And then we watch for how that gets resolved in the final lines of the poem. So the lifeboat is both one night and all nights. Certainly the repetition of the term night and the accumulation of nights in the father's experience emphasizes that doubleness. So it's a wonderful opening. All night in his lifeboat my father sang. It is the simplest lines that are sometimes the most beautiful, isn't it? And there are those lines that, in their mastery, find themselves on the other side of simplicity somehow. It's the matter-of-fact directness of the lines, a time, a place, and an action that disguises the depths in every sense of the experience. There's almost a kind of Anglo-Saxon quality to this verse. You come just short of hearing kind of definite caesura, pause in the middle of each of these lines. The sense of the poem's rhythms made up of so many lengths of lumber. All night in his lifeboat my father sang, to keep the voices of the other men who cried in the wreckage from reaching him. You can hear it almost all the way through. He sang what he knew of the requiem, of the hit parade, and the bits of hymns, until his ribs heaved, until the salt streaked the sheets in his night sweats. As night after night the reassembled ship scattered its parts on the shore of his bed, over and over again. This sense in Anglo-Saxon verse of rhythms being assembled with joists and girders knuckled together, constructing their sturdy vessels, if you like. And of course that doubleness in the line is picking up on the doubleness that inheres in the theme throughout of song itself, trying to sing away whatever it is that it would not hear. And the opening tercet gives us these binaries in the clearest form. Over and against the lifeboat is the wreckage. Over and against the father singing are the voices of the other men who cried. And then the tension that sets these two in relation to one another. That is, one set trying to keep the other set from reaching. And I think this is one of the most fascinating contexts of the poem, this sense of song itself as a form of escapism. That is, quite simply, there is tragedy that one would hear of, as it were, if one did not sing oneself. It is in our singing that we drown out, pun intended, the voices of tragedy that we would otherwise hear. And of course these have deep implications for the notion of song, most broadly defined, song and art, singing, as a form of shutting out what would otherwise hurt so intensely. And of course here the father has every reason, given his own helplessness and the helplessness of the men whom he hears, to turn to song, the possibilities of song, in the absence of the possibility of action, that sense of art as coming in to fill up or fill in a gap, an absence, an intractability even. Trying to find or create openings, possibilities of furtherance in what the song itself is. So that gets put on the table, but we'll want to watch how the poem as a whole embodies a gradual moving away from this notion of escapism towards something much more complicated and that begins to look more like a kind of reconciliation with what was lost. The poem begins with this idea of a simple escapism and then evolves in the direction of a much more nuanced understanding of how song itself engages with its own purposes and effects. And it's interesting to see the kind of desperation that's implied in the variety of songs that the father sings. We run the gamut from requiem, that is, from the heart of elegy itself, that is made quite explicit there, to popular hits with bits of hymns between. More going on there than just the naming of kinds of songs. if you can hear a pun there in bits of hymns, the voices of the other men would be bits of hymns, H-I-M-S, if you like, an inference that kind of gets picked up again later in Scattered Its Parts, but also possibly the grim implication of how it is that this boat the father was on was turned to wreckage in the phrase hit parade, a parade of hits that has left this ship sinking. And if you allow for those puns and entendres, you're looking again at the double effect of the song itself. The kinds of song that are meant to keep the voices of the other men from reaching him are actually recalling, each in its own way, the parts of what had been lost. Hit parade, wreckage, bits of hymns, voices of other men. Now, I guess up to this point we're solidly in the past, in the moment of the remembered tragedy. And it is here at this point of the sixth line that the poem begins to let go of the moment itself and drift away from it, if you like, in the same way that the father is drifting away from the wreckage. The poem drifts away from the original moment remembered there. He sang until he would never sing again, invoking the future of silence and reticence about the event itself, presumably. But look at the other shifts, crossings over that we witness here, scalding his throat with seawater until his ribs heaved, until the salt wept from his eyes on dry land. The transformation implied in seawater affecting a kind of burning in his raw throat, but especially where the past is associated with water and the present with dry land. He has, in being saved, ended up on dry land. And right there, even more specifically in the very middle words of the poem, ribs heaved, smack dab in the middle of the poem. The heaving ribs are both the heaving ribs of the ship and the heaving ribs of the father who weeps on dry land, the salt from the wet sea becoming the salt in his tears on dry land. But at the center of it, this sense of the father's own body becoming the vessel, if you like, in every metaphoric sense, of the tragedy. His body is both the vessel of survival, but also the vessel of the remembrance of the tragedy itself, and both heave, as it were, in the same place, boat and body as one, so that his body becomes the locus of the storming sea itself. The salt flecked at his lips in his squalling rages, beautifully resonant term. And then this carefully constructed line, streaked the sheets in his night sweats. Streaked sheets, sweats, EA, EE, EA. Sheets itself is both a nautical and nocturnal image, isn't it? But look then how Powell manages the transformation here at the center. The father becomes a kind of wreck in his squalling rages on dry land, streaking the sheets in his night sweats, and his song becomes weeping, which is going to anticipate the magical inversion that we get in the surprising final line of the poem. And then look what happens. It seems to be the shift from singing to crying that initiates the return, if you like, of the ship itself. The singing drowning out the ship, the crying from the dry land of his bed every night, becoming the shore on which the reassembled ship will come aground. Song drowns out, crying reassembles. The song becoming a cry. The escapist song of art becoming the restorative cry of despair in the memory itself. And the restoration has its own further ironies here. The song that keeps voices from reaching him in the beginning becomes the crying that in every sense harbors the return of the ship in memory. All wonderfully complicated there. As night after night the reassembled ship scattered its parts on the shore of his bed. So yes, a ship would be made of parts. The ship reassembled, breaking into parts again on the shore of his bed, running aground in his own mind, in his memory. But another sense too, maybe, or surely, we have the context of song itself, and song is made up of parts, and parts are shared. That is, parts of songs, your part in the song, your role in the tragedy, and so on. The the father's part in the song is to be the survivor. The voices of the other men who cried to reach him was another part. And so there's this sense at the end that the parts are being redistributed. The reassembled ship scattered its parts, and of course, by the final line, we do find that the parts have been traded in the song. It is on this basis, that is, with the parts scattered, that he goes out again to trade roles and become the drowned man among singing men. And so, yes, the wonderful and complicated inversion of singing parts comes full circle. They cried, and he sang. Now he cries, and they sing. And this all happens in the context of his being set out to sea again, that is, being returned, the poem again in that sense coming full circle, his being returned to the scene of a drowning, this time his own, among men who seem to be in some way hailing or singing out, the men singing to him as he drowns, with this interesting sense, with the reassembled ship scattering its parts, that the lifeboat eases him out again. So much in the poem has not been easeful. We've had wreckage, we've had scalding and heaving and squalling rages. We know that the lifeboat that saved him and that drifted away from the tragedy in both space and time is associated with wreckage, with scalding, with heaving. But of course there's the other lifeboat, the boat of his life, that is continually returning him out into the memory of the experience. And it's in that sense then I think that the lifeboat is not so much his life but memory itself, that is, memory as a lifeboat. And it's true, isn't it? Memory is the vessel that, in its making, carries you away from what it is remembering, but then also in its long survival eases you continually back out into the thing remembered. And so it is in that memory, it is in that lifeboat that he drowns each night among singing men, that he dies and they are resurrected. There is in the end this wonderfully complicated question of whether memory as a lifeboat is the thing that saves you or that drags you back out to face the fact that you have or have not been saved. In that sense, memory is the thing from which you cannot be saved and in which you drown. You can't be saved from your own memories. And where the lifeboat was the rescuing vessel at the beginning of the poem, it becomes the vessel that goes down, if you like. He eases out and drowns at the end. We can fold all of this back into our thoughts on elegy and Peter Sachs' claim that the central initiative of elegy is the remaking of the singing self, the father's remaking of himself in reference to and in grieving of the men who died in the wreckage. His remaking of himself involves a scattering of the parts, and his, in the end, taking the part of those who died. And that somehow in that gesture, in that easing out again into memory, there is this sense that the men themselves are resurrected in song. It is in song, in elegiac song, that the men are sung, and in the scattering parts of the song that the sung men become singing men. Not quite sure if I'm making sense of that there, but there's just this moving sense at the end of the poem that the father has somehow in his memory and in his later actions traded places with these men whose loss he has grieved. The end of the first line, father sang, the end of the last line, singing men. And so if we're to think of the poem as also an elegy of Powell's for her father, not just of the father elegizing the drowned men, then we have the sense of the speaking voice of the poem having to reinvent itself in relation to the scattered parts it envisions. The poem seconds or repeats the father's reinvention of himself in its own reinvention of all the terms and conditions of singing and escapism and suffering and resurrection in its own scattering of parts. The poet's voice joins with the voice of the father in this long journey of remembrance. That is surely the lifeboat in which this poem eases out into its accomplishments. The poem again is called The Lifeboat, written by Kerry-Lee Powell, published in her small volume entitled The Wreckage, published by Grey Suit Editions in London, England, 2013.